Hey everyone, it's Ed Thompson welcoming you, one and all, to my living room. I am working with Single Purpose Ministries in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I have the pleasure of coming to you every Tuesday morning and sharing some ideas, hopefully to make you think, to make you want to relate and connect more to God and to others and to yourself. That's why we are here. Our purpose is to do that. Now, one of the ways that we're going to do it this morning is just to feature a creator God who would come down to this earth and get so close to his prized possession. That would be us. We're made in his image. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how God came near and just let you rejoice in the fact that God does that. And these people were highly blessed. Why don't we just start with the gracious presence of God? And I'll talk very briefly about a man named Joseph. He lived way back. This is not Jesus' father. This man was in Genesis, sold by his brothers as a slave, then rose in Egypt to the second most powerful position that Egypt had. It's a beautiful story. He knew God was with him, and other people did too. Another actual extraordinary example of God's presence is with a spiritual kind of side. What I'm talking is a man named Enoch. He too was in the book of Genesis, and you can find him walking with God. And one day, he was no more. He simply walked home to God's home. And it's just a great thought to think, how present were they? I love to talk about the personal aspect of God's presence, because when you talk about his personal aspect, you're going to have to bring up the Virgin Mary. She carried God in her womb. Jesus Christ was in her womb for the 9 months until he was born. Now, how much closer can you get than that? To walk around and have the presence of God inside you. Just a good thought. I'm going to talk about David next. He was a shepherd boy, although he was well prepared to do battle the day he was called upon by God to kill a giant. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, you'll find him on the battlefield, essentially just him, the giant, and God. And David ran out there, took stones, and the very first stone, he dropped this giant to his death. And I just love how David knew the presence of God. Another man that knew God's presence, and we are going to talk about his omnipresence. That is, he's everywhere, every time. But Moses in the book of Exodus would tell you, oh yes, he is everywhere, but oh, was he with me for 40 years out of Egypt and all the way to the border of the promised land. And God did things like lead them at night with a pillar of fire and lead them in the daytime as a pillar of cloud. Now, if that's not presence, I don't know what is. Moses certainly was thankful to have a leader like that. And folks, I really do want to talk, maybe last and not least, but bringing the Apostle Paul into this. And it's a varied form of God's presence. For instance, he met Paul on what they call the Damascus Road, which it was, and he asked Paul, "Why are you persecuting me?" which Paul was at the time. And then he began to work in a way with Paul that Paul became one of the most extraordinary apostles and servants of God there ever was. But the number of times, if you read the book of Acts, you will see how many times God's presence drew near to Paul. And in such various ways, it was, and it is, just such a joy to read. So, where does that leave us? We've talked about biblical characters, and there are a ton more that actually met God. For instance, go to Matthew 17 sometime. When he took his inner circle, James, John, and Peter, to a mountain of transfiguration, he, Jesus Christ, became God in spirit, simply saying that he showed parts of him that no one else saw up to then. And I just am amazed at Jesus Christ showing all the godly presence that anyone can show. Now that's why I get excited. I just want to think this Bible is so wonderful and rich in things like that. But let's get personal for just a minute now. Has he ever come close to you in any of those ways that I've mentioned? I wonder, have you felt transformed by his presence, or just a personal wave of something in you knowing that you aren't in charge and you aren't leading what's going on around you? And there's just so much of the variedness of it and all the things that I've just mentioned. But let me mention a couple of verses that I really have thought about. For instance, one of the first memory verses I had, do you not know that the Spirit of God is in you? And it's also, this is 1 Corinthians 3:16. It says that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you. Once again, God's so present, he's within us. And then Colossians speaks of in chapter 1, verse 27, about Christ in you, the hope of glory. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to take your Bibles, if you would, and just kind of skim through them. For those of you who have yet to use a Bible, I hope, once again, that your interest is piqued to think about a personal God who comes presently and powerfully into people's lives and simply changes them for the good. As I talked about last week, how he's changed my life. But I'm just encouraging you to find examples in a great book that can't be topped. Let's see, I may just quickly say, I'm going to go ahead and hit the runway. I'm unable to work with kids right now except at Sunday school and church. And the reason is this. I've joined a ministry called Child Evangelism Fellowship, mentioned it to you months ago. School hasn't really started yet in Greensboro, so we cannot go into the schools, which we must do if we're going to do the work of the ministry, which is going in and having children read to us. We read to them, but primarily we tell them that there's a great and present God out there ready to receive them into his kingdom. No deal on that. Nothing's really happening, but when it does, I'm going to let you know of some experiences that I anticipate having. So folks, have a great day and enjoy whatever happens on this special day, and I'm talking election-wise. God bless. Love you all. Take care.